Please join me in welcoming our very distinguished guest, FCC Enforcement Bureau Chief, Loyaan Egal.
Thank you, Rick, for that kind introduction, and thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you, Chairman Wiley, for inviting me. I had the distinct pleasure of attending the Media Institute's Free Speech America Gala last month, and truly enjoyed being able to hear Bob Woodward, Michael Powell, Curtis Leggett, and Donald Graham speak at that event. As the last speaker in this year's Luncheon series, I decided to take a look at some of the remarks of the distinguished speakers who preceded me in 2023. Talk about no pressure. Blair Levin began the year by identifying things he believed were not being talked about or were being talked about in a weird way. He was able to weave in topics involving TikTok, broadband maps, Spectrum, and ACP in a very interesting way. Vint Cerf, who Rick just mentioned, the chief internet evangelist for Google, and the penultimate speaker in this year's series, spoke about the history of the internet and technologies that will be needed to communicate in deep space in the next decade. Mr. Cerf, as others have mentioned, is also known as the father of the internet. I, on the other hand, am simply the proud father of 2 children.
That's better.
The theme that cuts across these remarks is the critical nature of the communication sector. And while I won't be able to describe what I find that's being talked about in a weird way, or talk about what Star Trek type technologies are on the horizon to assist us with exploring deep space, I can provide you with a little bit of insight into what we at the FCC's Enforcement Bureau do to ensure a robust and trusted communication sector. We want innovations to flourish and protect consumers' privacy and sensitive data and the nation's security. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the Enforcement Bureau, which is home to an amazing group of dedicated and talented public servants, and which I've had the pleasure of leading for a little over 21 months. EB dedicates its resources to investigations and enforcement actions involving FCC-regulated services, equipment programs that significantly impact consumer protection and privacy, data security, cybersecurity, and supply chain integrity, national security, public safety, emergency services, and harmful interference, fraud targeting critical FCC-funded and administered programs, and fair competition and equal opportunities. I like to point out that even though the Enforcement Bureau was established last century, it's only 24 years old, having been created in 1999 under the leadership of Chairman William Kennard. Therefore, I'm putting out there that next year we'll be celebrating the Silver Jubilee to commemorate the 25 years of existence of the Bureau. For context about the youth of the Bureau, the Securities Exchange Commission and the FCC were created both created in 1934. Yet the FCC has had a division of enforcement since 1972. The inaugural front office leadership of the Enforcement Bureau at the time consisted of David Solomon as the chief, Brad Berry and Jane Magoo as deputy bureau chiefs, Richard Welch was the associate bureau chief, and Arlen Van Dorn, John Whiston, and Suzanne Tetrol were assistant bureau chiefs. I like to refer to them as the OGs of EB. As the 6th chief of the Enforcement Bureau, I follow in the footsteps of the aforementioned David Solomon, Chris Monteith, Michelle Ellison, who's the current general counsel of the FCC, Travis LeBlanc, and Rosemary Howard. One other piece of trivia I like to share about the FCC and the Enforcement Bureau is that we are statutorily authorized, along with the Department of Justice, to enforce the wire fraud statute, which is Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1343. So I remember when I first found out about this, and I had to tell myself, you've got to be kidding. You can't tell a former federal prosecutor that we can charge wire fraud and not have to worry about things like venue. Lo and behold, it turns out that when the Communications Act was amended in 1952, it resulted in also amending Title 18 of the United States Code to introduce Section 1343. Now fast forward 71 years later, when last week you may have seen in the news that my old office, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, was able to secure a conviction of Sam Bankman-Fried for, among other things, conspiracy to commit wire fraud and wire fraud for a multi-billion-dollar scheme involving the FTX crypto conspiracy exchange. This highlights for me the foundational importance that communication services and networks play in our society, and the importance that must be placed on ensuring their availability and integrity while mitigating efforts to compromise them, steal valuable and sensitive data, or to use them to defraud people. I'd like to talk a little bit about the FCC's unique perch. When I was first asked to come back to the Commission to lead the Enforcement Bureau, I joked that I was going to go from working in the national security related matters every day, working in a sensitive compartmented information facility known as a SCIF, to now holding my breath during the Super Bowl halftime show in the Golden Globes. Well, it turns out that joke wasn't that far off. The Will Smith, Chris Rock Oscars incident took place less than 2 months into the job for me. If you're curious, there were 66 complaints filed regarding that incident. But when you think about everything that the FCC regulates, which stretches from under the ocean with fiber optic submarine cables that physically connect the United States to the rest of the world, and through which approximately 99% of global voice and data services traverse, to outer space when it comes to satellites, and a whole lot of things in between, the breadth and the scope of the enforcement possibilities are unlike any other. As a sector-specific rulemaking agency with enforcement authorities, the FCC is sui generis vis-a-vis its sister regulatory agencies. And I'll try to keep the Latin French expressions to a minimum. A few examples to help illustrate this scope and uniqueness. The FCC administers multi-billion-dollar programs, the Universal Service Fund and the Affordable Connectivity Program, that are aimed at assisting low-income and rural communities with having access to vital information and communication services. But agencies that oversee large federal programs, such as the Social Security Administration or the Health and Human Services Department, do not have regulatory enforcement arms and have to rely exclusively on their Office of Inspector General and the Department of Justice to address fraud targeting their programs. Meanwhile, the FCC enforces the statutory and regulatory requirements associated with its programs, and the Enforcement Bureau has regularly conducted parallel investigations with the Department of Justice and brought enforcement actions and entered into global settlements addressing fraud. Just this year, the FCC, along with the Department of Justice, agreed to a more than $40 million global settlement to resolve the Enforcement Bureau's and the DOJ's parallel investigations into violations of the Commission's competitive bidding rules and the False Claims Act involving the USF Rural Health Care Program. The FCC is the only agency with consumer protection responsibilities that also directly regulates entities that qualify as critical infrastructure, which has been defined by Presidential Policy Directive 21 to include the communications sector. Because of the interconnected and interoperable nature of terrestrial, satellite, wireless, and submarine cable facilitated networks, the FCC, again, is the only regulatory agency that has an established process, the Team Telecom Committee process, to assess national security and law enforcement risks as they pertain to foreign investment and ownership in the domestic communications infrastructure. Just last year, we announced a consent decree in which a company named Truphone admitted that it failed to disclose accurate foreign ownership and transferred control of FCC authorizations and licenses without Commission approval. In doing so, the company circumvented the Team Telecom foreign investment and ownership vetting process. As part of that settlement, the company paid a $600,000 fine and was required to divest Russian ownership interests and ensure that all foreign investment complied with the Treasury Department's sanctions list. This summer, we issued the largest ever FCC fine, almost $300 million, against a group of US and transnational companies that were responsible for billions of illegal robocalls that were hawking auto warranties. Our unique enforcement authorities to direct the voice communication sector to take steps to effectively mitigate the auto warranty calls we identified in our investigation resulted in a 99% drop in those type of calls. Just last month, the Enforcement Bureau entered into the first of its kind consent decree with DISH to settle an investigation into the company's failure to comply with its satellite deorbiting plan. That settlement included an admission of liability and a $150,000 fine. As the world's first ever fine involving space debris, it made clear that the US government is serious about enforcing the rules governing satellite orbital operations. As you can imagine, my prosecutorial and national security background informs a lot of how I approach the enforcement challenges that the FCC faces. Listening to Bob Woodward a few weeks ago spell out the principles of investigative journalism that he believes help rebut distrust and contempt of the media really resonated with me. We apply at the Enforcement Bureau the ABCD principles of enforcement to help ensure that public trust in our approach is not misplaced. Those principles are accountability, balance, compliance, and deterrence. We need to ensure that those who violate the Communications Act and FCC regulations are held accountable. Our rules are not suggestions, they're obligations. It's our job to hold wrongdoers accountable. Companies should not consider breaking the law as simply the cost of doing business. And that means, when appropriate, requiring admissions of liability as part of our settlements. In exercising our enforcement authorities and prosecutorial discretion, we strive to make sure that we are striking the right balance. That means taking a holistic approach and considering all relevant factors in making an enforcement decision. And through our enforcement actions, we seek compliance with statutory and regulatory requirements, which for purposes of our settlements typically include a compliance plan to address the specific concerns that gave rise to the issue that we are addressing. Finally, when we take an enforcement action, we do so with the specific goals of achieving specific and general deterrence. Specific deterrence with the party against whom we're taking action against to ensure that the violative conduct is addressed going forward. General deterrence for those considering engaging in similar conduct. So now I would like to focus the remainder of my remarks on the work that the Enforcement Bureau and its role in spearheading the Privacy and Data Protection Task Force. First, a little bit of table setting. According to the Pew Research Center, 97% of adults in the United States have a mobile phone, and 85% of those adults have a smartphone. With that level of market penetration, few things in our society are as ubiquitous as a cell phone. As Chairwoman Rosenworcel stated when she established the task force, we live in an area of always-on connectivity. Connection is no longer just convenient, it fuels every aspect of modern civic and commercial life. To address the security challenges of this reality head-on, we must protect consumers' information and ensure data security. The amount of sensitive data that we generate using these instruments, who we speak with, where we are located, what we read, where we bank, or what we purchase, to name a few, and then entrust with companies that provide us those connectivity services is unprecedented in our history. Collectively, this is referred to as a pattern of life information because it creates a detailed profile of who we are, where we live and work, and who is a part of our social and familial networks. When nation-state threat actors gain access to these bulk data sets, telecommunication carriers collect and store, it can enable computer hackers and intelligence officers to better target those in the government, military, and other sensitive roles, which then creates a national security risk. I understand from a press report that at the NTCA Telecom Executive Policy Summit earlier this week, DHS Cybersecurity and Information Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, Executive Director Brandon Wales, stated that we are currently in an acute period of heightened threat, and that sophisticated cybersecurity threats from cyber criminals and foreign adversaries are pre-positioning for a future attack on the United States. Even more ominously, he stated that it is the worst that he's seen in the 20 years that he's worked on homeland and national security issues, and that the telecom network operators must play a pivotal role because the government by itself can't stop everyone that wants to do harm to the United States. For our part, and consistent with Mr. Wales' clarion call, we have more than doubled the number of people handling these type of cases and hired individuals with privacy and data protection experience. Jolina Quaresma, who most recently served as the Common Sense Media Head of Law and Tech Policy, has joined the Enforcement Bureau as a Senior Policy Counsel. By early next year, the Enforcement Bureau's front office will have 4 senior officials with significant DOJ and interagency experience on national security, foreign investment, data protection and cybersecurity, and consumer and civil litigation matters. Now, how do we approach our enforcement investigations in this particular space? Privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity are 3 distinct disciplines that many times have significant overlap. Privacy is fundamental to our liberty, and its sanctity must be protected. That means looking at how FCC-regulated entities are treating the data that they have been entrusted with as part of the customer service provider relationship. Data protection goes to how service providers protect the sensitive information with which they have been entrusted. And cybersecurity focuses on how those companies protect the networks in which the sensitive data is housed. Our investigations can touch on one or each of those disciplines. From a task force perspective, the task force coordinates across the agency on a rulemaking, enforcement, and public awareness needs in the privacy and data protection sectors, including issues related to data breaches, such as those involving entities providing FCC-regulated services, and vulnerabilities involving third-party vendors that service commission-regulated communication providers. The task force recently announced new proposed rules to protect consumers against scams involving SIM card swapping and port-out fraud. These schemes have become more and more commonplace, and law enforcement agencies are keenly aware of these schemes being scaled up throughout the country. The chairwoman shared final rules with her colleagues, and they are currently under consideration as we speak. The Commission also proposed a $20 million fine against Q-Link Mobile and Hello Mobile for failing to protect consumer privacy. The proposed fine made clear the company's apparent failure to protect the privacy and security of subscribers' personal data. The companies apparently failed to authenticate customers' identity before providing online access to customer proprietary network information, or CP&I. Our teams handling privacy data protection and scam calls and scam texts are working together, given how many times information that's harvested from data breaches can be used by bad actors to defraud people through carefully tailored targeting using the compromised sensitive information. As the previous speakers have made clear, the communication sector is vital to who we are and how we live our lives. As part of the nation's critical infrastructure, FCC-regulated companies provide essential services that underpin our society. The pandemic served to highlight just how integral these companies are, from making telehealth visits possible to bringing educators into our living rooms. And our job in the Enforcement Bureau is to ensure that the public's trust in these companies isn't misplaced. The depth and the breadth of the impacts of these technologies and services are vast. And when I think about our work at the Enforcement Bureau and our collective effort to fulfill the FCC's mission to protect consumers, protect the national defense, and ensure the public's trust in that our communication networks that the trust isn't misplaced, I think back to just a couple of days last December before Christmas. On December 20th, the DC Circuit affirmed the FCC's ability to revoke the Section 214 authorization of the U.S. subsidiary of China Telecom, a Chinese state-owned enterprise telecommunications company. That highlighted the Commission's authority under the Communications Act to regulate the nation's communications infrastructure in furtherance of national defense. And I recall working on that case at DOJ several years prior, helping lead the interagency effort to submit the national security recommendations to the Commission. A day after that landmark decision by the DC Circuit, on December 21st, at the Commission's open meeting, the FCC unanimously issued the Notice of Apparent Liability following the Enforcement Bureau's investigation for the matter that I previously mentioned involving auto warranties. When I stepped back and I thought about those two events, they demonstrate the vigilance required to keep our communication network safe and to enhance the public's trust in them. And my job is to ensure that the Enforcement Bureau will remain ready to meet this moment. And we will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, for your very informative remarks and the outstanding work you're doing at the Enforcement Bureau. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask a few questions. Sure. I'll go to the audience. Okay, questions?
Let's stand from Ontario. I'm wondering how your enforcement authorities have to enforce something that's only in a statute that the commission doesn't have regulations to enforce, and I'm thinking in particular about the congressional resolution that would return the privacy, broadening privacy rules sometime in 2017, I think it was. Is there something in the statute that tells you how much money goes forward or anything like that? So how does that implicate your enforcement?
So I couldn't hear the entirety of your question. I think you were asking about enforcing matters where there's statutory authority but not rules that have implemented the statute. And I think you were asking specifically about the open internet matter. So I'm not going to comment on that matter since it's pending as a rulemaking matter. But I think, as I mentioned, the Commission has had a long history of enforcing matters and doing rulemaking, and that's what makes us unique, being able to be a rulemaking and enforcement agency. And so I think, I'm not familiar with specific matters in which we've enforced items strictly based on the statute, but I will give an example, for instance. I mentioned the wire fraud statute, right? There's no specific rule there that says the FCC can only enforce wire fraud based on these specific regulations, right? So I think we look at the law, we confer with our colleagues, especially in the General Counsel's office, and we proceed as we believe we should.
Okay, thanks. So the Office of the National Cyber Director has a proceeding right now on harmonization of cybersecurity baselines, and in a lot of the comments that were filed, there were examples given of lots of agencies that, notwithstanding the federal legislation from last year and sort of the administration's emphasis on harmonization, that a lot of agencies are out doing a lot of different things on cybersecurity. Even within the FCC, there's several different flavors of cyber regulation that are popping up. I was curious for your thoughts on that OECD proceeding, how you see the FCC fitting into and supporting the administration's priority for harmonization.
Are you specifically referencing the critical infrastructure cyber reporting
No,
requirement?
that's one thing. I'm
Okay.
talking more the broad question that OECD is asking. They sort of parked the incident reporting stuff as being DHS's problem
Got it.
to solve.
Yeah, and as I said, being that we regulate critical infrastructure, that's an area we're also trying to reconcile to make sure that whatever reporting requirements are going to be that come out for the communication sector are consistent with, for instance, notifications for CP&I breaches. I think that's a whole of government issue. Having worked in the interagency, glad I don't have to do that on a regular basis anymore. but I think harmonizing and understanding the different areas that the government agencies are responsible for regulating or enforcing matters in, I think it's important to understand that. So we have expertise when it comes to communication services, and that should be harmonized with whatever requirements are being considered. And with that, we have our Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau that does a lot of the coordination with the executive branch on those issues. But we make sure that we have the ability to participate and make sure that the Commission's equities are also being considered.
Back in the communications daily, there's always been sort of criticism, not criticism necessarily, questions about TV levying fines when the actual collection thereof being such a DOJ responsibility. What kind of communications are there with DOJ? Is there any improvement or areas that they can improve whether it's collection of funds or things when DOJ brings a fine?
So this issue has come up a lot with regards to robocalls, and we've recently sent over in forfeiture orders more than $500 million worth of forfeitures for DOJ to collect. As I've said as recently as yesterday, our colleagues and partners at the Department of Justice are very dedicated public servants who have a ton of priorities. But we believe this is a priority in itself, and the chairwoman has specifically asked for the ability for us to enforce and collect our own forfeitures in this space. And I think part of that, where we can help with that, is we've also asked for some additional authorities. She's mentioned publicly getting access to Bank Secrecy Act information that Treasury administers. That will allow us to expand our investigations, not just looking at how many bad calls were made or how many illegal robocalls or texts were made, but being able to dig a little bit further into the finances behind that and being able to trace that money. And being able to rebut arguments about inability to pay and things of that nature. And if we get those authorities, we think we can make a compelling argument why we should be the ones to collect it. But if we are not given that authority to collect, we think we'll be able to present more compelling cases for DOJ to pursue.
We have one more.
I was just curious if you comment on the impact of AI on the enforcement bureau's work in terms of robocalls, data privacy, et cetera. I saw a recent notice about AI and haven't read yet AI and robocalls, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that, how much more difficult is that going to make through?
Yeah, when you hear about AI, it's everything under the sun is AI. And I was just kidding with Maureen here at my table about how this be the optimal time for Allen Iverson to do commercials related to AI. But yeah, the commission is looking at that. It's issued a notice of inquiry, or will be. I think it impacts our work because it's just going to make it easier for bad actors to target consumers. But we're also, interestingly, looking at how AI can assist us, or we'll be looking at how AI can assist us to combat bad actors. So it's one of those things with any new technology, we'll see how it eventually plays out. But I think, we want to be cognizant of what's out there. I was at a conference one time where we get together and we talk about what we're seeing, in the enforcement phase.